We're gonna talk about how y'all are out here saying Coretta Scott King's name and not putting any respect on it. We'll get into that. Today, I want to tell you about a new film that's coming out this week. Origin, directed by Ava DuVernay, is a biographical film about the journalist Isabel Wilkerson and her journey through writing her book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. As today is MLK Day, I wanted to share something about MLK and Coretta Scott King that I learned while watching the film. We'll discuss the movie's overall plot without any spoilers. I'll also talk about the book that inspired the film. And I want to talk about the legacy of both Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. Notice how I haven't said Martin Luther King and his wife. That's because recently Coretta Scott King's legacy has been reduced to the wife, a black woman partner that is praised for her ability to endure and forgive her partner's shortcomings. And in actuality, Coretta Scott King was an amazing peace activist and musician long before she met Martin Luther King. She was instrumental in the civil rights movement all on her own, and her presence in King's life influenced and shaped his own political development. We're going to talk about how y'all are out here saying Coretta Scott King's name and not putting any respect on it. We'll get into that. But first, let me introduce myself. It's JoJo. If you want to travel the world but you don't want to be a bad tourist, join me. I am a diversity facilitator, a PR specialist, and a conscious traveler. I help people travel responsibly. My goal is to help us think globally, act locally, engage ethically, so that we don't replicate colonization, contribute to climate change, disrespect local communities, and appropriate the cultures of the places that we visit. On my YouTube channel, as of right now, there are 3 types of videos: travel vlogs, videos on travel tips, and videos about global politics. This one is a video about global politics. Last December, I got the opportunity to attend a film screening of Ava DuVernay's film Origin. You know, I be getting invited to stuff. The film is based off of the book Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, written by the journalist Isabel Wilkerson. The book asks the question, is racism in the US just one aspect of a larger caste system? By connecting it to other forms of caste or casteism that may have existed in Nazi Germany as well as India. I haven't read the book, and I will read the book one day, but, I have about like 6 books in my queue, and this is definitely added to the list, but I told myself I could not buy another book until I finish those books, so we don't even have to get into that, because for many of us, for obvious reasons, books are sometimes not the most accessible way of digesting information. So this film dives into the main character's journey in writing the book. It starts off with the murder of Trayvon Martin. And as a journalist, Isabel Wilkerson is called to write about this case. And as she's reviewing the evidence, it appears to her that this is something more than just racism. And as Isabel is writing this book, she has a series of tragedies that happen in her life. She loses multiple loved ones. And I love the way Ava DuVernay used grief as a common denominator for the human experience. Regardless of who we are in the course of our lifetimes, there are 2 things for sure. One, that we will experience grief through the loss of a loved one or someone close to us. And 2, that eventually everything dies. And so it is one thing that is a constant within all human beings' experience. There was a Q&A after the screening, and Ava DuVernay describes how she uses grief to connect people and how grief is something that we can all relate to on some level. We're all grieving something or someone in a way. And you might be thinking, I ain't grieving. But aren't you grieving? Aren't you grieving the loss of Trayvon Martin or Sandra Bland or George Floyd? Don't you grieve when you see these images of chattel slavery. How can you not grieve when Ava DuVernay presents the horrors of the Holocaust? Or when Ava DuVernay shows you images of the Dalits in India cleaning the sewer system and they are literally covered in human feces. How can you not grieve for these people and the loss that they have experienced? And in a way, there's a collective grief that we are all going through when, whether we are observing as a bystander or experiencing firsthand these horrific levels of oppression. It is that grief that really comes through in the film. And I'm gonna just tell you right now, when you go see this film, bring you a box of tissues, not just for you, but for the community. Another thing that Ava DuVernay talks about in the Q&A session was how she specifically wanted people to go into the theater and watch this film. Because as you're sitting there in the theater and you're surrounded by people who are watching it and reacting to this film at the same time you are, we're laughing at the same time, we're crying at the same time, we're shocked at the same time. There is this collective grief that we have to sit with and ask ourselves, how is it that we are allowing this caste system to continue? And that doesn't really happen when you're reading a book in your own solitude, in your own home, in your own mind. In short, the film was amazing. Everybody needs to go see it. I laughed, I cried, it was better than Cats. And truly, like, there are parts of the film that are so funny. And there are parts of the film that pull at your heartstrings. And I mean, that is the mark of an amazing film, to do both and to leave the audience with some more questions and some things to think about. Amazing. Chef's kiss. So in the film, Isabel Wilkerson is writing this book and she decides to take a trip to India. And it is during this trip that she learns about Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King's trip to India back in 1959. She learns about Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, how he was to the Dalits what MLK was to Black people. And he was very much influenced by Dr. King's work. Now, this came at a time when Gandhi was assassinated about 10 years before this time. And also at this time, MLK had just finished leading the Montgomery bus boycotts. So many people know Martin Luther King for his nonviolent approach, and if you haven't known, that is largely inspired by Gandhi's nonviolent resistance to British colonial rule. Dr. King went to India and he specifically wanted to see the so-called untouchables. The untouchables are the derogatory term for the Dalits, which are the lowest caste in the ancient Indian caste system. And I do want to apologize because I think I've said untouchables a little too much and I've sort of said Dalits. But because I was reading the MLK letter, I just got used to saying untouchables. And so I apologize if that comes off as offensive. So Dr. King had a lot of sympathy for the untouchables, and he had felt that in some way they were being left behind after India had gained its independence a decade before his arrival. And there's one instance where Dr. King goes to a high school in Kerala, India, and the principal introduces him like, oh, hey, young people, come. I would like to introduce you to a fellow untouchable from the United States. And at first, Dr. King is shocked. He's like, nigga. But eventually he begins to understand that there are connections between how the untouchables are restricted in India's society and the way that black people experience segregation in the United States South. And he describes how Black people were forced to live in isolated ghettos marked by an airtight cage of poverty. When he returns from India, he gives this speech and he says, yes, I am an untouchable, and every Negro in America is an untouchable as well. This is new language for us to examine our experience, especially as Black people in America, but regardless of where you are in this caste system. After the screening, Ava DuVernay describes how she was very determined to release this film before the 2024 elections because she felt that it was important to the conversation just to ask, just to have that question of how else can we describe racism in America. Isabel Wilkerson has given us new words. So the way that I'm understanding this now is that, first, let's start from the basics. Racism precedes race. The reason why that is because slavery existed throughout human history, throughout society. But what was unique about the way that Europeans enacted slavery onto Africans is that it was specifically chattel slavery. This idea that you're a slave, your mama a slave, your children are going to be a slave. They will, for generations to come, will be born into slavery. The way that European colonizers treated enslaved Africans was a form of oppression that didn't really exist before that. You know, when someone would come up and be like, well, why are generations of people slaves? Why would you treat someone like this? Then the idea of race was created to justify that, like, oh no, don't worry, these people are not people like you and I. They're not human beings like you and I. They are a different race, essentially a different species. And so the behavior and the experience of racism precedes the actual adoption of race as an idea. Because before that, you had your nationality, you had your ethnicity, you had what region of the world you were from. But this idea that there are Blacks and there are whites and there are people of color, the racialization of people, that came after the behavior, and it was used to justify the horrendous behavior of colonization and slavery. If I'm understanding this correctly, the caste system is simply a way to uphold this oppression. It is the glue that keeps the system running. Regardless of where you are in the caste system, you play a role in perpetuating it. One of the questions that Isabel Wilkerson asked, and one of the questions that fueled her inquiry into caste, why is it that a Latino man of Jewish heritage killed Trayvon Martin, a Black teenager? And does that count as racism? Is it racism when both the perpetrator and the victim are both racialized? And is it racism when, in the case of Nazi Germany, both the perpetrator and the victim are both white or European? And in the case of India, is it racism when both parties, the perpetrator and the victim, are of the same race or even ethnicity in a way? This question can be asked about issues all around the world. You know, when we think about the Uyghur Muslims in China, or South African apartheid, or what is happening in Israel and Palestine, I think that as we look forward to creating a new world without these levels of oppression, as progressive thinking people, we need to begin to approach these issues with a bit of nuance. Sometimes things are specific to a certain group of people. Like, obviously in Nazi Germany, we can call that anti-Semitism. But the overall structure and the way that it is able to be perpetuated, it's not necessarily racism. It's a form of oppression. Can we call that casteism? And I think that this is particularly important when we think about Israel and Palestine. So many people who are pro-Palestine are being called anti-Semitic, when we need to approach this with a lot more nuance and understand that any people, any group of people can perpetuate a form of racism or casteism. what is happening in Israel and Palestine, what happened in South Africa, what happened in Nazi Germany, is a type of apartheid. It is a caste system. So let's break down these pillars of caste that Isabel talks about in her book, and that's also detailed in the film. The first one is divinity. It's the idea that God has ordained these people to this degrading life. And we've seen this with slavery where, there were slaves who were taught that the Bible says that you are supposed to be a slave, or there's the curse of Ham. There are instances of that in the Israel and Palestine conflict. Second one is heritability. Again, chattel slavery was different than previous forms of slavery because it essentially said that your mama, you, and all your kin are slaves. When enslaved Africans gave birth, even if their children were fathered by a white person, were also slaves. Third, endogamy. And there's this idea that you can't marry out of this treatment. You can't marry out of slavery. And this occurs in Palestine as well, where if an Israeli wants to marry a Palestinian, that Israeli person has to become Palestinian. The Palestinians can't marry out of it, out of the oppression. It's like, oh, you in love? Well, get your ass in that open air prison. Fourth is purity and pollution. And we hear this all the time in so many different ways. The dominating power will always talk down on another group of people as if they are dirty, they are, polluting our environment. We cannot mix with them. We cannot drink out of the same water fountains as them. We cannot share the same restaurants as them. We can't even live in the same neighborhoods as them. We want to be completely separate because they will pollute our pure society. Next up is occupation hierarchy. Both Isabel Wilkerson and Martin Luther King had talked about how the Dalits were limited to one job, which was cleaning out the sewers and the plumbing system. It's honestly the hardest part of the film to watch. And MLK had related this to how Black people in America had multiple levels, multiple barriers into entering into certain industries. Next up is dehumanization and stigma, and this is where the stereotypes live, the ideas that we have about certain groups of people. It's meant to degrade them and to basically tell lies about them, that they are violent, or that they are greedy, or they are uneducated and dumb. Next is terrorism, and we can certainly see terrorism that is happening in Gaza, but also there are Palestinians in the West Bank who are being attacked, and relate that to the terror that happened in Nazi Germany where there were book burnings, and we can relate that to the terror that happened to Black people in the US South where there are lynchings and the KKK rallies, and nowadays we have police terror. And the last pillar is superiority, because there might be multiple levels on this caste system, but we know who's at the top. I'm kidding. But yeah, so there is this idea that there is one group that is superior to all other groups. And the thing that is wild, and I think that is the part that is so important to remember, is that anyone within the caste system, anyone at any level, is invested in perpetuating the caste system. And that's how we get a Latino man of Jewish heritage kills and murders a Black teenager because he's walking around his neighborhood at night. As the world changes, I think this level of nuance is really important. The US is a capitalist empire whose entire goal is to sustain its own wealth and its own power. Capitalism will adopt and co-opt any movement that is a threat to its wealth and power. And I mean, we've seen this in the example of Republicans using Martin Luther King's legacy to preach non-resistance, or how companies will proclaim Black Lives Matter, but are still perpetuating racism through their recruitment and hiring practices. And in my experience, I have seen the way the world has shifted its vitriol. And I want to bring up a little story time, just a little story time, a tiny story time. So, oh God, this was like almost 10 years ago. Oh my gosh. So I was in Germany back in 2015. A week before I had landed in Leipzig, Germany, there was a huge neo-Nazi rally that, good God Almighty, I know my ancestors are looking out for me because I was not there. I was shocked when I found out about this rally because the majority of the time that I was in Germany, I never felt racialized. I never felt like I was being discriminated against. Certainly I felt like I stood out because, especially at that time, there just wasn't a lot of Black people in certain neighborhoods and cities in Germany. I mean, Berlin is different, but like Leipzig and East Germany, you know, there just isn't a lot of Black people. But I never felt like people were racist towards me. So I just remember being there and thinking, well, like, what are the neo-Nazis upset about? Who is the target of their violence and their rage? And there was this one time I was in the bad part of the city, Eisenbahnstraße in Leipzig. And I began to notice that, like, oh, this is where a lot of the Arabs live. This is where a lot of Turkish people live. This is where a lot of the immigrants live. And I'm just walking, I'm minding my business, and all of a sudden the police pull up, hop out the car in front of me. And, you know, I'm Black, so I'm like, oh shit. They grab this young man. They strip his jacket off of him. They pat him down. It was a stop and frisk happening right in front of me. But it wasn't a Black person. Like, I've seen this imagery before, but I've seen it with Black people. But in this case, it was an Arab man. I mean, to me, it's like, he's still light-skinned. Like, I don't understand. I don't see the difference, but obviously the difference is there. And it just, in that moment, I was just like, oh, okay. It's the Muslims. It's the Muslims and the Arabs that y'all hate. And since then, you know, recently Germany has had an uptick in neo-Nazi rhetoric, particularly towards immigrants and Muslims. In France, a young man of Arab heritage was killed by the police, and that sparked tons of protests throughout the country. And France also has a ban on hijabs. India is attacking its Muslim communities and boasting this sort of Hindu supremacy. Look, Modi and his people, it's not even just the Muslims though, because they out here killing sheiks in Canada. That's a whole nother story. We'll get into that another time. There's the concentration camps of Uyghur Muslims in China, and even Egypt has banned the niqab. I hope I'm saying that right. It's similar to France's hijabi ban, but the niqab is a head covering where you only see the person's eyes. And so that was weird because Egypt is a Muslim majority country. And while they are more on the liberal side of Muslim majority countries, I say that because, you know, they allow drinking, you don't have to wear a head covering, they're not as modest and strict about some of those rules. It's interesting. Another way that I see caste coming up nowadays, so mainly in America and Europe, there's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. Immigrants are blamed for everything that is wrong in the country. It's important for us to remember that when someone is deemed illegal, it becomes easier to justify doing illegal things to them. I want to be clear that I'm not saying that anti-Black racism doesn't exist or that, you know, we're beyond racism. That's not what this conversation is about. Racism is an aspect, is one way in which the caste system is upheld. I'm not saying that this is right or wrong. I'm saying that this is a new way of having more nuanced conversations about these types of oppression. Because when we say what is happening between Israel and Palestine is racist, a lot of people say, like, how could it be racist? There are reasonable questions for that. I think that when we say that it is a caste system, it makes a lot more sense. Anti-Black racism is still very real here in the US and around the world. But I think that as Black people who are fighting for our liberation, or for any people, any group that is on a quest, on a journey towards liberation, it's important that that does not come at the expense of another group, and that as we move forward, we don't leave people behind. And that's what I think this conversation around caste can do for us. Yes, we're anti-racist, but we're also looking at the other forms of oppression, social stratification, and casteism that exist. Because, as Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I know a lot of Martin Luther King's quotes have been co-opted. Not only have Martin Luther King's legacy been co-opted by confusing his passive resistance with non-resistance, but now Jonathan Majors, a Black actor, has co-opted Coretta Scott King's legacy to justify his own atrocious behavior.
Because that team, that unit, right, Grace has to be in a certain mindset to support Coretta Scott King. You know who that is? That's Martin Luther King's wife. Michelle Obama, Barack Obama's wife. I'm just gonna say this. My temper, my shit, my trauma, blah, all that said, right? And I'm not saying I'm a great man. A great man. I am doing great things, not just for me, but for my culture and for the world.
How would you describe your relationship?
She's held me down like a Coretta, you know?
In his statement, Jonathan Majors is taking Coretta Scott King's legacy as a musician and a peace activist in her own right and reducing it down to the wife who endured King's shenanigans. Look how Coretta Scott King put up with shenanigans. Why don't you put up with my shenanigans? And now I have a new girl who is sticking beside me through all of my shenanigans. Nothing that Jonathan Majors has done could challenge the status quo or racism or the caste system the way that the work of Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King has done. Starring in $1 million film for $1 million company owned and operated by white people cannot compare to leading a movement. I'm gonna go through the accolades and achievements of Coretta Scott King. Most of this is based off of the memory from a book report that I did in middle school. Coretta Scott King was a member of the NAACP and the Race Relations and Civil Liberties Committee at Antioch College. She dedicated her life to serving others and uplifting her community. Coretta Scott King was a gifted musician and vocalist. She was a peace activist long before she met MLK, and she used her love of music and her amazing voice to unite the movement. When Coretta Scott King went to India with MLK, she was particularly interested in the women's movement. The people in India were fascinated by Negro spirituals, and during their trip to India, Coretta Scott King shared those songs she sang and she taught them to the communities in India that they visited. There was a quote from MLK where he said, "Coretta sang just as much as I lectured." That really shows the partnership between them, that she wasn't just holding him down or, in the background, but that she had her own lane and her own purpose. Coretta Scott King was instrumental in Martin Luther King's political development, particularly on his views of the Vietnam War. In her later years, she became pivotal to the women's rights movement, and she was also a big supporter of the LGBT rights movement. And I want to emphasize this, because this was a part of my book report that I thought was really interesting. We would not know MLK's legacy the way we know it today if it had not been for Coretta Scott King. There would have been more co-opting and more silencing of his more radical views if it had not been for Coretta Scott King, who, after his death, really focused on preserving his legacy. And it cannot be stated this enough. She was a peace activist in her own lane, in her own right, before she met Martin Luther King. And together they were a partnership. If you want to look at them as couples goals, okay. But don't think that they are couples goals because she endured his infidelity. That's not the lesson that you should be taking from their marriage. The film and the book also go into the anthropologists Elizabeth Davis, Allison Davis, and Burleigh Gardner and Mary Gardner, who were two couples that teamed up to write about the Deep South. There's a whole section of the film that dives into the Dalits and the leaders of that movement in India. Of course, they talked about MLK, and I decided to focus on MLK because it is MLK Day. I think that we could all really benefit from seeing this film. We could all certainly benefit from reading the book, but the film might be a good intro into the concepts in the book. Y'all have got to see this film. You've got to see it, 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 gotta see it, gotta see it, gotta see it, gotta see it. Please, if you can, go to the movie theater and watch this film. I don't know if it's going to be streaming. And because today is MLK Day, I hope that you take some time to volunteer or donate. It doesn't have to be today, maybe this week, or maybe throughout Black History Month. I saw this meme on Instagram that said, "Don't talk to me about MLK unless you've read his letter from a Birmingham jail." I concur. I agree with that statement. And the thing is, I believe his letter from a Birmingham jail, as well as a number of his other speeches, are available on YouTube, so you don't even have to read it. You can just listen to it. And there are tons of other civil rights activists, Malcolm X, even Fred Hampton. There are tons of people who have speeches available on YouTube. So that's something you could do for MLK Day as well. So if you're picking up what I'm throwing down, please share this video with a friend, like and subscribe to my channel. And if all those things are just too much effort, like if you're just like, ugh, I just don't have the time, then at least keep Coretta Scott's name out your mouth. Out your mouth.
Keep my wife's name out your fucking mouth! I'm going to, okay?